Welcome back to Horror Movies.
In a few seconds, you're going to listen to a frightening tale narrated by me. Fear awaits you. Watch out and take care. The movie begins on a plane, and a flight attendant takes a cup of tea to a woman. The woman's daughter Katerina wakes up and asks if they're almost at their destination, and she tells Katerina to go back to sleep. A woman from the back begins to scream for help as her husband collapses. Katerina wakes up and searches for her mom but doesn't find her. The plane begins to shake, and Katerina sees a strange woman sitting behind her and casting a spell. The woman opens her eyes, and Katerina sees that they are white. One of the engines then explodes, and the plane crashes. Katerina walks into the woods with her leg brace and realizes she is the only survivor of the plane crash. 20 years later, Katerina is with her daughter Diana in a park, and they get interviewed by a news team. The reporter asks her how she's coping with the plane crash, and she informs him she doesn't think about it. He then asks her if she's told Diana about the plane crash. Diana says they're not afraid of flying, and they end the interview. Later, Diana and Katerina board a plane, and they realize it's the only plane that is still traveling regardless of the snowstorm. Diana tries to sit somewhere else, but Katerina doesn't allow her. A man named Alexei helps Katerina sort her luggage and introduces himself. He sits beside them, and an old couple sits at the back. As the plane is de-iced, Nikolai gets impatient, but a flight attendant calms him down and informs him they'll soon be taking off. Katerina gets startled by some flickering lights, and Alexei calms her down. Galina begins to have a panic attack because of her fear of flying. Katerina, who is a doctor, goes to her and calms her down. She informs Galina that she is afraid of flying, but she faces her fears and doesn't run away from them. She also gives her some pills, and Galina takes them. Nikolai talks to a strange artist named Pavel. He asks Pavel why he won't stop drawing, and Pavel says it calms him down when he's nervous. The plane prepares to take off, and Katerina gets nervous. She walks into the restroom and locks herself inside. She then takes some pills to calm herself, and she washes her face. Katerina hears a sound from outside the door, and as she opens it, she sees herself in a house. She walks around the house and sees herself back on the plane as she opens another door. Katerina walks back to her seat and sees Diana talking to Alexei. Diana informs him that Katerina was in a plane crash and was the only survivor. Katerina tells her to stop talking, and Alexei apologizes for her accident. The plane takes off, and Katerina apologizes for sounding rude. They talk for a while, and Diana shows him her drawing of a house and a dog. A while later, the few passengers on the plane fall asleep. A red light suddenly begins flashing outside, and strange hands appear on the windows. Katerina has a dream where she is a little girl and is at home with her mother. She asks her mother if the scar on her leg will heal, and her mother informs her that scars don't heal but remain for life. Katerina sees a reflection and sees her mother covered in sores and bruises. Her mother talks to her and eventually walks to wash the dishes. As she washes the dishes, she begins acting strange, which scares Katerina. Her mom then turns around and appears as the old witch from the plane. The plane goes through some turbulence, and Katerina wakes up. She calms Diana down, and Alexei tells them the plane will shake for a while but stop eventually. Galina gets scared, and her husband Evgeny tries to calm her down by telling her it's just minor turbulence. The turbulence gets worse, and Diana begins to scream. Evgeny tries cheering Galina up, but he feels dizzy and collapses. Galina screams for help, and the flight attendants rush to her. Pavel rushes to Evgeny, and Katerina tells Diana to remain in her seat as she rushes to the back. Katerina asks for a first aid kit, and they lie Evgeny on the floor. Alexei performs CPR on him, but he doesn't respond. He suddenly sits up with white eyes and grabs Katerina's neck. Katerina falls to the floor, and Evgeny lies back down. The flight attendant gets the first aid kit, but a bottle falls out. Evgeny's pulse begins to fade, and Alexei asks Katerina what they should do to help him, but she doesn't respond. Evgeny eventually dies, and the turbulence continues. They all rush to their seats, and the oxygen masks release. A flight attendant rushes to Diana and helps her with an oxygen mask. The plane then shakes, and the attendant hits the top of the plane and gets knocked out. Diana continues screaming, and Katerina puts on her mask. She then falls into a trance where she is a little girl and sees the witch saying some incantations behind her. The turbulence stops, and Katerina rushes to Diana's seat. Alexei helps the flight attendant, and Katerina sees that his hand shakes. She calms Diana by making her draw something cheerful and tells Alexei about the witch she keeps seeing. She also mentions how her plane crashed the last time she saw the witch and says she's come back to finish what she started. Alexei fails to believe her and says her medications are making her hallucinate. As the passengers sit, Katerina asks Alexei about his hands and why they are shaking. He tells her about an accident 5 years ago where some terrorists bombed a location he was working in. He mentions that he was buried under a pile of stones when he woke up, and it's affected him ever since. Katerina swears she heard her mother's voice on the plane before they took off and says she feels like something terrible is about to happen. Meanwhile, the medicine bottle rolls to where Nikolai sits, and the fluid begins dripping. Nikolai sees Pavel drawing in his book and asks how he can get inspiration from a dead person. Pavel ignores him and informs him that he wants to go home to his family. Nikolai gets up and walks to Pavel. He takes out his phone and shows Pavel pictures of his children, but Pavel ignores him and continues drawing. Nikolai calls him a freak and walks back to his seat, and Pavel draws him as he smokes. Katerina talks to Alexei and tells him about the scar she's had on her leg from a fracture she sustained as a child. She then lifts her trouser and says that the scar disappeared after the incident with Evgeny. Alexei calms her down and reminds her she has a lovely daughter. They then wonder why the captain hasn't addressed them, and Alexei has a migraine that makes him feel like his head is about to split open. Diana talks to someone behind her, but Katerina looks and doesn't see anyone. The flight attendant emerges and informs the passengers that they've changed their destination to the nearest airport, and Katerina realizes it's the same place she was headed when she was in the plane crash. Nikolai gets annoyed and confronts a flight attendant. She tells him to fasten his seat belt, and she walks away. Nikolai is unaware that an oxygen mask is leaking under his seat. The medicine begins dripping beside Nikolai, and Diana informs Katerina that the mysterious girl she was talking to said she would leave her as soon as a man starts blazing. Nikolai pulls out a cigarette, and as he lights it, he is set ablaze. He tries to get up but cannot because of the seat belt. Katerina and the others rush to him and put out the fire with a blanket. Nikolai is already severely burnt, and Katerina tells Alexei that the witch won't leave her alone. She then helps Alexei sit down as the migraine kicks in again. She checks on Diana but sees a strange figure and follows it. As she searches for the creature, she falls into a trance where she is at home with Diana. Diana reminds her of their flight, but they decide not to travel and stay in the house. Katerina then gets up and walks to the restroom. She opens her pills but decides not to take them and throws them into the toilet. Katerina walks around the house, and a strange black creature appears as she looks through a door. She begins searching for Diana, and the house begins to crumble. She eventually opens a door and sees herself kneeling in the plane. Diana runs to her, and after hugging her, she tells Katerina that she walked right past her and was behaving strangely. Alexei walks to her and asks her to help them with Nikolai. She examines Nikolai and realizes his air tracts are blocked, and he's unable to breathe properly. The flight attendants ask what they can do to save him, and they go to get water. Katerina talks to Alexei as she looks through a first aid kit. She sees Pavel drawing and asks him how he can draw at a time like that. He informs her that it calms him down, and Katerina gets angry and yells at him. Alexei calms her down, and she sees Galina walking into the restroom. Nikolai tries to communicate with them, and Pavel pulls out Nikolai's phone and shows him a picture of his family. Nikolai sees the picture and eventually dies. Katerina apologizes to Pavel, and he tells her that people tend to think about the most important things in their final moments. Katerina takes Diana back to her seat and realizes that Galina hasn't come out of the restroom. She goes to call her, but the flight attendants try to get her to go back to her seat. Evgeny's eyes open, and they are white. The flight attendant opens the door, and Galina isn't inside. She then tells Katerina to return to her seat and stop scaring the other passengers. Katerina then gets attacked by some demonic hands, but she breaks free. She decides to make her way to the front of the plane, and Alexei tries to stop her. He begins bleeding from his eye, and Katerina helps him sit down. The attendants walk to them, and one of them begins vomiting water as they talk. She eventually chokes on the water, and her eyes turn white as she dies. Katerina then sees Pavel's drawings and realizes he's been drawing all the things she has been seeing. As she looks through the book, Pavel turns to ashes, and Katerina and Diana begin screaming. They run to the door, and Alexei walks to them. He and the flight attendant try to calm Katerina down, but the flight attendant gets dragged away by an unknown force. Blood begins to gush out of Alexei's head, and as he apologizes to Katerina, he collapses. Katerina eventually opens the door and sees she's on the plane she was on when it crashed. Katerina and Diana try to leave the plane, but Katerina realizes she's stuck in a loop. Diana disappears, and Katerina sees the strange figure. She runs toward it, and she slows down. The witch appears and talks about how Katerina wasn't meant to die, and she didn't want her to know what death felt like, so she put her to sleep. She then lets Katerina live a life she's not going to have and says she's a special girl. She then lets Katerina wake up, and we realize she's still a child. Katerina then realizes that Diana has been giving her clues on how to survive the plane crash. She sees Evgeny has a heart attack and collapses. Her mom rushes to help him. The plane then begins crashing, and Katerina rushes to the back to meet her mom. Her mom gets knocked out when she hits a chair, and Alexei puts her in a chair at the back of the plane and fastens her seat belt. He is then killed by a metal shard that stabs his head and gets dragged out of the plane. The plane then crashes and gets broken in two by a tree. The following day, Katerina and her mom are still strapped to their seats and eventually wake up. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more videos like this. Thanks for watching.